Welcome back. Well, yes, as you've seen, there are two gentlemen joining us to make sense of the budget and tell us how this will affect you. Yeah, that's what we intend to do today. So we've got Mr. Boniface Chizia, who joins us virtually, and Mr. Paul Alaje joining us from our studios in Lagos. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us on the program today.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for having us. Yes.
All right, let me start with you, Mr. Alaje. Yes, we heard the budget of economic growth and sustainability. We've seen the assumptions, but to a lot of people, it appears as though it's a yearly ritual, but it's more than that, we reckon. So give us your impression of what you make of these assumptions concerning vis-a-vis the economy. Perhaps we'll start with that and then take it a little step further.
Good morning once again, and thank you for having me. I've looked at the presentation made by Mr. President yesterday. Quite a number of interesting assumptions. First, government is expecting to finance this budget. One of the major window of financing, it remains what will come from crude oil, as we'll be expecting over 3 trillion in revenue expectedly from crude oil. That on one side. We're also looking at exchange rate of about 410 naira to $1, even though what CBN is currently displaying or what is applicable now in e-window, it's a bit above that. On the second side. On the third side, our government is looking at debt service of over 3 trillion. In fact, that is even higher than what we're expecting to generate in revenue from crude oil alone. Government is considering a number of capital expenditure from what Mr. President presented. But by and large, we are seeing a bit less than 30% of capex when compared to the entire budget presentation. So we have a deficit of over 6 trillion, which is a huge, huge concern. Mr. President also said he understands if people are concerned and that they have right to be so. The comment that we made is that it is borrowing that brought us out of recession. And I'm wondering how borrowing has brought Nigeria out of recession. Maybe as the conversation continues, we can look at the implication of borrowing, or maybe it was even the foundation for going into recession in the first instance, based on economic principle and what is applicable this moment today.
All right, so we'll come back and take a look at some of those projections and see what could that have been predicated on. Were they right assumptions or otherwise, Mr. Alaje? But just give us a moment. Mr. Chizia, how do those assumptions match up with your perception about budget reality in the country at the moment?
Well, I think to a large extent, I think the assumptions are not terribly off the mark. If you take the fuel price, that has been pegged at $57 per barrel. As of yesterday, oil sold at above $81 per barrel. Even last month, it was almost 79. So I think that if you look at the oil, yes. If you look at the growth projections, the growth has been projected as 4.something%. Well, that's a bit ambitious when you look at it, because I would expect that probably by the end of this year, we'll probably be growing about 2.something%. But okay, so we'll wait and see what will happen next year. And so if you look at inflation, we said target is 13%. And it's about 17% now. So it's coming down. So again, that is to some extent realistic. So I think that to a large extent, I think they've tried as much as possible, to try and be a bit realistic. But of course, we're talking about targets, we're talking about projections. So the thing is for you, what that does to you is for you to, to have what to set your sights on, and like a beacon, to guide you as you go on the journey. So you're not going to realize those targets and projections the way they've been put there. It would be a wonderful coincidence if we do. But I think that we are in the right direction. But I think the thing we should commend the executive, for presenting the budget when they did. Present the budget at this time of the year.
Okay, Mr. Alaje, so when you did highlight some part of that when the president says, well, this borrowing got us out of recession. So one wonders in what context, because, they usually have said that we have to spend our way out of recession. So could it be that they talk about funds being available via borrowing, which we then spend to bring us out of recession? What context could that have been?
And when you look at the last recession, it was as a result of seizure on both demand side and supply side. So there was market seizure. People could not go out. And when you look at NBS report that said Nigeria had grown by over 5%, one of the things you notice is that the transport sector, particularly road transport, had increased significantly to close to 80 or 90%. When you look at other sectors that were responsible for that huge recovery, it was because of the lockdown policy that was government put in place in order to save lives as a result of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, coming out of the pandemic or the lockdowns as we had them, last year, it is commonsensical and it is normal that you are going to see a jump. The truth is that central bank particularly, and I think Niger Microfinance Bank has tried to support households, support businesses, etc., etc. We cannot say particularly that it was because we borrowed. And you see, when it comes to borrowing, should we even continue to borrow? And I'm seeing over 6 trillion naira that will be borrowing. When you look at oil revenue, we have 3.16 trillion as presented by Mr. President. And when you look at debt service, we have 3.61, excess of about 500 billion that we need to get. If we realize, which is a bit of concern based on Mr. President's presentation, we had reduction in revenue in 2021 projection because of shortfall. And when you look at what was presented in MTEP that was based on pro rata, to me, we have not been able to achieve revenue target, particularly when we depend so much on crude oil, which seems to have concern. So when we say that borrowing is what brought us out of recession, there may be other things that maybe President or the team has not mentioned to us, but to say that we came out of recession will not be that. But when you look at the implication and impact of debt, which is the third and the final analysis, when it comes to should a country continue to borrow, there are 3 explanations, 2 traditional and 1 a more recent time as economists has put in place. What is the relationship between debt to GDP on one hand? When you look at our debt to GDP, we are doing below 40%. Countries are doing 50% and so on and so forth. One, we assume that Nigeria can keep borrowing, but that is just a necessary condition. There is another condition called sufficient condition. By the way, if you satisfy necessary condition but not sufficient condition, it means you should not accept to take such decision. Now, when it comes to the second decision, which is what is happening to debt service to revenue, you should not do more than 1/3 of your revenue. And there are reports here and there, we did over 60%, we did over 90%, which means borrowing is no longer an option. Now, where is the impact? The last and the most recent evidence by economists reveal that the impact of debt is more important than the first 2 analyses. For Nigeria, debt has increased by over 20% on average in the last 5 years. But when you look at GDP growth, it's less than 2%. Meanwhile, you should not have less than half of increase in debt. So the numbers don't agree with it. Economics don't agree with it. And even explanations. It's very tough to explain that while we're having less than 10% of the rate of borrowing on the impact of GDP, how did that borrowing then brought our economy out of recession? For me, I think because people were released, the lockdown were no longer there, and which is the evidence released by the National Bureau of Statistics, and evidence that we can lay our hands on and review that more and more people are getting back to their farms, more and more people are getting back to their businesses. Private sector have been unleashed, they can go back to their businesses. That is a better explanation to say why we are out of the recession and why we have the growth. And by the way, the growth rate was based on a negative growth rate, which was -6%. So it now agrees with reason that if you have -6% and you release your people to do businesses, exchange, the demand side is released, supply side is released, you are going to see such growth. So that is explainable now and it's more understandable than what we had before.
Those who would still say, perhaps economists like yourself, Mr. Lajo, would say that, well, we are just technically out of recession. How significant, you know, that will be in the scheme of things, you guys will tell us later. But let me switch to Mr. Chizia. Well, Mr. Laje had mentioned a number of things concerning revenue and all of that. But if you look at the budget that the president presented, one of the two things he mentioned that's a little concerning for me, actual revenues were 34% below target as of mid this year. And he also said that the federal government's share of oil revenue was 51% below target. And non-oil revenues were also poor, according to him. Now, all of this is from the 2021 budget analysis from the president's perspective himself. And there are still some assumptions for the 2022 budget. How optimistic are you, given these figures that the president quoted himself based on his assumptions in the budget he presented last year, that this year's budget, or rather the next year's budget, will do any better?
Well, okay, let me first of all make some comments about getting out of recession. I think that we should put things in context. You wouldn't get out of recession if you didn't have activities. So you needed to get back production activities going on in the economy. And given the state of the economy, as at that point in time, when we had a recession, we had pandemic, then you needed to spend some money. You needed to pump some money into the system for you to get out of recession. There's no two way about it. There's no know how you get out of recession. If you are stagnant and you don't spend money and there was no production, no activities in the economy, then nothing's going to happen. So, okay, let me take that. But I think that issues about projections and so on and so forth, which the presidency has put in the budget, I think that's it's very easy for us. You know, talk is cheap. You know, so we commentators, analysts, and so on, we sit at the back and then we just make comments, and we have to take those comments, you know, as they come, because the budget office of the federation, they have all the facts and they don't know the analysis. And they have no cost.
Mr. Chizia, just 1 second. On that same issue that you have raised of us spending ourselves out of this recession, there is a big argument around the fact that we need to be a producing economy to be able to do better economically as a country. But right now, and a number of people would point out, so economists as yourself inclusive, would say, wait a minute, we are not a producing country. Consequently, the Naira cannot do any better. Consequently, the economy cannot do any better unless we are spending to produce. So would you say that we are spending to produce?
Well, that should be the target. If you are spending on infrastructure and so on and so forth, you'd expect that eventually to have knock-on effect, you know, on your productivity. I mean, the issue of the productive base of this country it's been a work in progress since 1986 when we introduced the structural adjustment program. We tried to diversify the revenue base of this country away from oil, and then we'll not be able to make. There's been no magic. And so when people look at the rate of exchange and they go on saying lots of things that they've been saying, you know, so you expect to make omelets without breaking eggs. You cannot have productivity. It's not a tap. You don't just turn it on and water begins to flow. It's something that it takes some time. It must have some focus.
But Mr. Chizia, we have had quite some time. A number of people would argue that it's 21 years into the Fourth Republic, and it would seem like, okay, at some point in the same Fourth Republic, we exited, owing any country, and then along the line, we just seem to be going right into it again. So in terms of borrowing to produce or creating the enabling environment for government to strengthen the private sector and micro and small businesses to produce, how significantly would you say we have done? Let's just say over the past 5 years.
Yeah, we've not done too well. I think the verdict is certain on that. Not done too well. I think that there are also reasons why.
So then how much time do we need to do better?
Well, it's up to us. We have to get our acts together. You know, we start from our politics. You know, get our politics together.
What's the missing link? You've talked about our politics. That would differ from our policies, wouldn't it?
Yes. Well, to some extent, you know, politics comes first. There are two sides of a coin. You know, so you have politics and economy. I mean, take the governor of Central Bank. There's a limit to what he could do. You know, given our environment, given the way he came on board.
Okay. All right. Let me ask. You've not answered my question, Mr. Chizia, but let me bring that same issue to Mr. Alaje. What's your take on all of that, all of the comments concerning our capacity to produce and all of that?
Well, there is a popular African adage that says, if you spend 20 years to rehearse madness, exactly when are you going to practice it? Our economy perpetually has remained primary, whether you call it oil or agriculture. Before oil was discovered, the authorities then say we need to diversify away from agriculture. Several economic tests can attest to that, to the claim. Apart from that, when we discover oil, after some time, we said we need to diversify away from oil into what? Back to agriculture. The truth is that agriculture is primary in the level of production, and oil is also primary in the level of production. And if you look at what National Bureau of Statistics reported in Q4 report of 2020, trade report by National Bureau of Statistics, over 90% of our export was on oil. So it's an economy that is not producing. Oil itself is primary. Why is it primary? Because nature to a large extent is involved. The same with agriculture. And what did we export after that? We exported seeds, which is also agri output. And when you look at hierarchy of things, it means that we are not contributing to nature. That is 210 million people. Our industry are not effective. And by the way, man is meeting. I really don't know why it's challenging for more than 21 years in recent time, and 1960 till date, we still find it very challenging to transform our economy from primary to secondary and to tertiary. And if you wait with the comparison, the largest country in Asia is China. China has huge population, just as Nigeria has huge population compared to the rest of Africa. But China is no longer dependent on primary, whether it's a natural resource or agriculture. You may want to go a bit into the Americans and consider the North America. United States is the largest, among the countries in North America. United States does not rely solely on primary, whether it's a natural resource or agriculture.
But Mr.
Then fast forward again.
Just a second. Let's stick to the issue of this budget thing. Do you see the budget right now encouraging the OPS to produce?
Well, if you ask me if I see the budget encouraging, I would say that quite a number of things. This budget is not sectorial in nature. This budget will help us to sustain our civil service. It will also help us to combat insurgency, quite a number of good things. But a budget that will deliver us from economic penury and economic concern, it will be sector targets. And one of the sectors that will take lead will be capital expenditure on power generation. Apart from power, education, etc., etc. Just like last year's budget, this budget is more than ×2. What we spend on service is more than ×2 of the total allocation to education and health together. That is, when you combine all going to health and combine all going to education, ×2 of those and more is what we'll be spending to service. So how will it encourage when most of the projected revenue or most of the projected borrowings is going to be we are going to be spending on service of debt? And it's more dangerous even when these borrowings will be coming from outside Nigeria, knowing fully well that recent loans that we are getting are now coming from commercial loans, talking about bonds, euro bonds, etc., etc. So do I think it will? Yes, it will, but to what extent will be a big concern and challenge?
And I think this has brought up that classic conversation. I mean, when you talk about paying salaries, which is a given, you hear government ask you, do you expect us to retrench people? We have these people on civil service on our payroll. About 4 trillion naira, thereabout, of the budget is going, or the appropriation bill is going to that one. 6 trillion is going to the recurrent angle. You've referenced this against capital expenditure. And that classic question of, so what is the alternative really? If you say that we need to have more capital expenditure as opposed to recurrent expenditure or just paying salaries, what is the alternative? Do you expect us to cut that, the recurrent, provisions, which means we're going to cut jobs? So in terms of realistically speaking now, is there an alternative really?
Well, a lot of alternatives we have that government has, and some of them are in this document. Some of them are things that are not contained in this document that the president submitted yesterday. $57 to a dollar per barrel. I think that should be jacked up to about $60. That will help government save over 44 billion naira without doing anything, just looking at the document. If government could make that adjustment, that's on one hand. On the other hand, government needs to reconsider what we call revenue to the GDP, tax revenue to the GDP. Nigeria is perhaps one of the least, if not the least, in the entire Africa. And when you look at countries that have borrowed so much and we look at their debt to GDP, what we are also not comparing is their revenue, tax component to their GDP. So if you want to borrow like them and we don't want to earn like them, then someday we might have a lot of concern to deal with. So what are the other alternatives? When you look at capital expenditure, we do not need to necessarily prepare this budget and put a lot of money that government must spend on capital expenditure. It is obvious that federal government or state government alone will not be able to finance capital expenditure. Then we can now come together, look for more private sector investors, and they don't have to be the super rich. A good example of what has happened in Lagos is Oshodi-Apapa Expressway, where one of the richest African, particularly the one that have constructed that road. How do we have more and more of these people join government to put effort in place and perhaps to solve some of the challenges?
Interestingly,
We
you
also
just
have
said, pardon me if I could just jump in, you just said they don't have to be super rich, but the example you gave is the example of super rich person getting involved. And interestingly or incidentally, the head of the budget office of the Federation was on our sister program, Politics Day, yesterday, where he was talking about this PPP arrangement, saying, well, he's been in the private sector, he's been in government, and from his experience, things like that rarely work. That even getting the fine details, the negotiations alone, can take a long time. So for him, he just thinks that the government has decided to go this way because this is what will work, especially in the context of the challenge we have. So how possible is it really realistically, again, to have this PPP arrangement when, we can only count a few of those super rich individuals that we have?
Now, most of the projects that Nigeria have tried to adopt this PPP on are projects that cannot generate revenue. So if there are no revenues or there are no direct impact on private sector, it will be tough for them to get involved. You have seen what we want to do with roads now by towing it and asking people to invest, and government will have some percentage of the investment. That will work because private sector is not just looking at putting their fund and hoping that that will be taken for tax credit. They are looking at benefit of today, that we can have, and setting up a body or an institution to manage what comes into road construction and other capital expenditure that government should have naturally spent in form of budget will help us conserve monies that are not even available in the first instance, or money that we would have spent on, say, recurrent expenditure or capital expenditure, wanting to expand our budget. Again, when you look at what National Bureau of Statistics has reported in terms of organization or sectors, and which is why I think budget should have been in sectors and target to grow some sectors year in, year out, maybe 4 or 5 years. When you look at the report shared by National Bureau of Statistics, it reveals that operators within ICT and so on and so forth have continued to grow with or without recession. What seems to be missing is when we now compare that with the revenue government is generating from this sector, it is not growing the way it is expected. So maybe government just need to reconsider to say, if this sector is growing, why is revenue component or revenue coming from government with the sector that have been growing according to National Bureau of Statistics not growing exactly?
All right, we'll come back to this conversation when we return from this break. Join us again. Welcome back, Mr. Chizia. So what budget revenue or revenue alternatives can we leverage on? Well, if you call them low-hanging fruits, fine. But lots of people have raised concerns as to where we can, how to fund the budget, which is always a challenge. So what do you see? How can we take advantage of it?
Okay, Chamberlain, I need to make some little corrections, from what I've heard so far. I think we cannot diversify from agriculture. Agriculture is the mainstay of Nigerian economy. What we try to do with agriculture is to get value addition. So, like my colleague just observed, we don't want to remain at the end of exporting primary products. We want to add value. But agriculture remains the mainstay of Nigerian economy. It contributes 20% to our GDP. In terms of employment, massive employment goes into agriculture. Now, second point I also want to make comment on this. You cannot have public-private sector partnership without that project bringing in revenue.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chizia. Could you just shed a little more light? When you say agric is the mainstay of our economy, are people talking about it in terms of the revenue we get from that? Or how do you mean?
No, we're talking in terms of GDP, productivity in the economy. We're talking in terms of employment, the percentage of people employed in this country. In fact, if you look at this administration, you look at the presidency, even the budget itself, we are still talking about intensifying efforts in the area of agriculture. So we cannot be saying that we diversify from agriculture. No, we want to have value addition. So instead of exporting primary products, we want to process them, add some value, create more employment opportunities before we export. Because I don't wish to say this because many people are listening to us, and we don't want to make sure we lead them with the wrong impression. Now, if you talk about where we're going to get revenue, it's very easy. The shortest cut is to remove the oil subsidy. Now, the oil subsidy we're talking of oil subsidies of the order of probably 900 billion a year. The budget for education is 400 billion. Budget for health is 400 billion. In spite of the fact that UNESCO, they've said we should do 16% on education when we are doing 4%. And if you go to health, we're doing 15%. We're doing much less than that. But so if you want where you get revenue, quick revenue, find a political will to remove the subsidy today. And that's the fastest. Yes.
I'm still trying to get. Yeah. Well, did you say diversify from agriculture or to agriculture?
No, agriculture. Agriculture is there. It remains the mainstay. We can't diversify from agriculture. Agriculture is there. We intensify effort in agriculture. In fact, when you have food security, and then once you remove hunger from any problems, then you almost the seriousness of that problem is mitigated. So you remove. What we are trying to do is to say to get the impact of agriculture on the economy to increase its impact. So instead of exporting mangoes and oranges and so on, you produce a juice, you can it, and you export. That's what I'm saying. And I also emphasize that agriculture remains the mainstay of the Nigerian economy. There's no two about it. If you in terms of GDP, in terms of people that are employed in agriculture, you go to the informal sector, go to rural areas, it's all agriculture. I mean, now today, in terms of what sector to go to again, will be
Mr. Chizia, I think that the part of the conversation, I mean, from what I've heard so far, is the fact that yes, we are huge on agriculture in terms of potential, but when it comes to what we derive from agriculture, when you compare that to oil revenues, it's still a far cry. So I think that conversation is largely centered around ensuring that agriculture, being the mainstay, as you call it, is indeed the mainstay in terms of generating revenue. And you've referenced value addition, which I think is a general consensus on how to build agriculture in such a way that we can get it to do very well, perhaps better than our oil revenues. But in terms of looking at what we have right now in the context of this budget, in context of where we are, I imagine that getting agriculture to do well might be a midterm issue. But where we are right now in terms of raising more revenues, I know you talked about the PPP arrangement. You referenced it as well. Perhaps you want to finish on that one because Mr. Laji thinks it's the way to go. You started off on it. If you could just finish up on that one.
Yes, I think that when you are constrained, and I think to a large extent, Nigeria remains attractive, so that's why we have been able to get all these loans and so on and so forth. All you need to do is to improve on your investment environment, improve on it, bring more sanctity that we've just done with the oil sector, so you have Petroleum Industry Act, has just been implemented. Once you do that and people begin to come in, then you have to do that because we have constraints and we have to come to terms to the reality that we have these constraints. And so, like as you just observed, PPP certainly is a way to go. And remember, we have an agency that is specially dedicated, to make sure that, we gain some traction in that direction. We have infrastructural, constitutional, agency that's supposed to be doing that. So it's not something that government does not do. But we need to intensify efforts on that.
So another part of this conversation which has come up time and again, and the president has had to respond to it, is the borrowing aspect. And I'm not sure how much of it you have touched on personally. So there's the conversation of whether or not it is healthy. Some even say we are even borrowing to repay what we have borrowed to service our debts, because when you look at the revenue we get in terms of with oil and the dwindling, oil revenues we got last year, some say we have to borrow again just to service our previous debt. So, working our way around this and saying that we need more revenue. So, are we going to get to tax more? I don't know what your view is on that in the light of where we are right now as a nation. What is this whole conversation around debt? What does it mean to you?
Well, let me tell you. I think most of us economists, we put our heads in the cloud. I'm telling you. This country has no alternative but to borrow today. Let somebody tell me what you're going to do. I mean, people want proposals and so on and so forth. Those are long term. You have a crisis, your house on fire, the roof on your house on fire. And you're talking about, you're dancing around and you're playing games. We have to borrow. There's no two-way about it. But what we need to do is to make sure that it has to be targeted borrowing. We need to plug the leakages. Now, most of the problems we have in this economy is that lots of leakages. Even when
so which one comes first? Well, borrowing before plugging leakages, or plug leakages, borrow? How do you reconcile that?
I don't know whether I need to sequence them, but I think that we have to be up and doing. We need to, I think that the leakages are terrible. I think we need to do something like leakages. If you ask me, yes, if you have holes in your bag, and you're putting water into that bag, I mean, you know which one to tackle first. But it's not just like that. So when you look at it, it's not like that. It's not sort of where you want which one should come first. This country has to run. So when people say we're borrowing, we mustn't borrow, so what then do we do? Now, there are lots of countries, if we don't borrow, the crisis we have today on our hands, will be a child's play.
I'm going to throw that question to Ms. Alaje, because you say economists, most of our economists will have our heads in the cloud, will have to borrow. That's the only option. Ms. Alaje, what say you?
Yeah.
Well, if we check what Debt Management Office reported in February, Nigeria devalued from about 390 to 410. Because of that devaluation, we added 1 trillion naira to our debt profile. Who is going to pay back the money? It is easy. The easiest way and the lazy way out of an economic imbalance is to quickly go and borrow. What have you done? You have postponed the evil day to a future date. I also need to correct something. When we say agriculture is the mainstay of our economy, and therefore we should not be talking about the diversification, rather we should be talking about deepening. I think what the economy actually said otherwise. For a country with huge population, such as we have, and I was making comparison, I was going to land on a thought. When you consider Germany, you don't hear about German farm, you hear about German machine. Because this country have huge population, and they are in fact the largest in their continent. Nigeria must diversify. I am not particular about agriculture or about oil, but we must diversify, whether it is agriculture or in oil, into production. And this is where states can even become more sustainable, because they will earn personal income tax. Federal government we heard from company income tax. There will be more for people to consume, and we're going to get more from VAT. But when we say that, don't worry, let's continue to patch it as we go. Let's continue to borrow, because that is the only way we have right now.
Sorry, how is that different? I'm sorry, how is that different, the talk about production? How is it different from value addition? Because isn't that the same, philosophy of value addition? Take this raw material, get it into production, add value to it. Is that one and the same thing for you, or different?
Well, it depends on how you call it and how deeply you want to explain value addition. because mere buying raw meat and I roast it and I sell it as suya have also added value. It depends on. But when you are talking of value addition, that has to generate huge number of jobs. And when jobs are created, you are going to be having taxes going to state government. You are going to be having revenue going to federal government. People are consuming. You are having VAT. That is when the tax component of the GDP will increase significantly. And watch it. For all of us in the studio and the other guests that is joining virtually today, if I ask, for the four of you, where would you love to spend your holidays? And why is it that of the $30 billion, about $300 billion that is going to come on tourism in the next 4 to 5 years, why are we going to participate less in terms of revenue? What happens to our tourist centers? Why are they not being patronized the way Nigerians want to patronize the one outside? Because the environment for development, this is so very important. We are talking about growth and sustainability, but what guarantees sustainability is the environment for development. When you read National Bureau of Statistics report, it shows that rather than attracting more investment, we might not be attracting investment as much as we do because of exchange rate environment. We are not actually sure whether it is 400 or 500 as it is being reported from some headquarters. That on one side. We are not also sure what the output in types of electricity will be today. So quite a number of concerns that we need to tackle headlong, and this will not come by mere borrowing. If you want to borrow and say we want to develop the entire Nigeria within 5 or 10 years, and let's just borrow all the money and we'll generate the revenue, but that may make sense. But we are saying we are borrowing, and the impact, you may want to read the National Bureau of Statistics report and have some and deduce all of these facts that have been mentioned. If we are borrowed on the average of over 20%, according to several reports put together by the Debt Management Office, and the growth shared by National Bureau of Statistics showing that it's average of 2%, then should we continue to borrow? I'm very concerned if you say continue, borrowing should continue is the way to go.
So, Mr. Chizia, our concluding moments now. In addition to your response to what Mr. Alaje has said with that last question, add to that, if they keep saying we're within the threshold, oh, 23, it's still okay, it's not up to 40. So when we do get to 40, what then happens if we exceed that threshold? So respond to that in conclusion to your statement. Yeah.
Well, if you listen to the president during his presentation, he did say that what is revenue problem is not debt problem. I think that I go with that. I agree that debt is mounting. You know what? Why I say we put our heads in the clouds is that we have a budget to prepare today, and you have to do the budget. Now remove the money we projected to borrow, which is 5 trillion naira. Remove it today from the budget and tell me how you run this country. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we should continue to do that, but I'm saying that as it is today, we have no choice. And the president is also right in saying that the problem we have to a large extent is that we don't have revenue. We're not generating revenue. You know, our tax to GDP base, like as mentioned, is 9%. In fact, we're projecting to grow to 15%. And he did say, the president in his presentation did say that if we get to 15%, now this cry about revenue to debt servicing will begin to, get ameliorated. So I think that is a challenge. We make comments and we don't put ourselves in that. We put ourselves in a situation. I said today, I'm preparing this budget, and this is the situation today. And you're telling me to do this and do that. I just said to it, for instance, remove subsidy, petroleum prices, and put up this. Announced in March they are going to remove subsidy from petroleum. Have they been able to do that? And so now we said so. I just said so when he asked me what's the fastest way, what's the low-hanging fruit. I said, yes, remove subsidy. But I know it's going to take some time. I know that it's not going to be easy. When you do that, the unions will be up in arms. And you have crisis on your hands. We have Jonathan experience, 2012. This country was almost brought to a halt. So, yes, it says that we have to put processes in place, and they're sequential. You have increases in tariff of electricity. We had a program for this increment, and we did not do that. And now suddenly we're trying to increase. Where I live, I've suffered 100% increase in tariff overnight. And so, not many people can take that. So,
all right,
because we failed.
Mr. Chizie, well, yeah, about that subsidy. Well, after all the hue and cry about the subsidy, look at where we are today. So they made a point, say, well, look, if we go further in this, we'll just keep going on and on. Well, I have to thank both of you for coming on this morning, Mr. Boniface Chizie and Mr. Paul Olaji, both of them economists. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
All right, we will be back in a moment. We'll talk about, well, just hang on there. We're back in a moment.